St. Andrews has brought me nearer to Jesus and continues to in new ways every day.
We are invited into following Jesus on the way of life.
I feel like I'm at home when I'm here, and my relationship with the Lord has just begun. I didn't have one until I came here, and I'm so thankful.
I really see the heart of Jesus in this community, and it's just like one beautiful, multi-generational family.
That's what the entire Bible is about. Receiving the goodness of God and His mercy and grace and forgiveness, and that being the catalyst and the power to step on the journey of following Him, following Jesus.
God put that in us, a natural desire to serve Him, serve others, and that's what we're doing here.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Dana, and it's great to be here with you, an honor to serve here, especially on this stage. You may recognize me from previous morning moments if you've been tuning in, or some announcements videos. Aside from those things, however, I do other things at this church too than just record videos. I serve here with our Leadership Institute, our SALLY program, which St. Andrews as a community started a few years back with the goal of discipling young people as leaders in the kingdom. Now, in the 2 years that we've run this program, we have invited young people, post-grads, into this community from all across the country. We've had these people come from Missouri, they've come from Maine, Pennsylvania, one came from as far as Yorba Linda. And they've come into this community. They've been invited here to learn as a part of this body. Now, the fact that they're invited here from all across the country is a reflection of some of St. Andrew's most amazing qualities. This is a place of welcome, of hospitality. It's a place of invitation and a place of connection. This last year, we welcomed them into a pandemic-stricken community. And I'm sure you experienced this as well. It was connection that was our greatest challenge this last year. And so it was on the forefront of my mind these 9 months with these associates that we had, trying to get them to stay connected, to feel like they're really a part of this thing here. When we had to move things virtually, when we had to plan activities that were outdoors and distanced, I was constantly asking, how can we really get them to feel connected here? And it showed up in some amazing ways. Some congregants here showed up for these associates. Jeff and Marilyn Beck supported them in so many different ways. Adele and Brian Green opened up their home and invited 2 of these associates to live with them. Joan Coleman baked them cookies every single week. We found connection in some beautiful new ways, but we were no longer able to rely on our typical methods of community building with them, our typical methods of connecting. And what this unprecedented challenge gave us, however, was a gift where I found myself thinking a little more critically about what does it mean to really connect with people. And even now, as I'm stepping into new social engagements again, as we're getting back into the swing of things with our social lives, I find myself feeling kind of awkward. I don't really know how to do this anymore. And so personally, I'm asking myself this question: what does it take to connect with people? Well, we have been in the middle of a new series called Flawed Masterpieces over these last few weeks, where we're taking a look at some of the least likely characters in the Bible and the way that God speaks to us through them. After all, the Bible isn't just a manual for life. It's actually mostly narratives through which we see God's relationship with humanity reflected. And one narrative in particular caught my eye and struck me in a new way as I've got connection on the forefront of my mind. It's the story of a eunuch who models what it means to connect. It comes from the book of Acts, and I'd like to share more with you if you would entertain me this morning. I'll give you a bit of background on the book of Acts first. This book takes place after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and its record of God's miraculous acts being carried out by his disciples and his followers. And in chapter 8, where we'll be today, we hear the story of the very first Gentile convert. So this is the moment at which the proverbial walls confining the gospel to the Jewish community are torn down, and our very first non-Jew is welcomed into the family of God. Would you read along with me? We're starting in Acts chapter 8, verse 26. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch. Now, if you don't know what this term means, a eunuch indicates someone who was asexual, whether by force, by nature, or by choice. They could have been castrated, they could have been born sexually ambiguous. Jesus explains this in Matthew chapter 19, if you want to look it up. But this eunuch is an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Candace, which means Queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship. When it says he'd gone to Jerusalem to worship, it doesn't mean that he crossed the street or he drove uptown. No, scholars estimate that the journey from what was Ethiopia back then to Jerusalem was about a 5-month journey each way. So that is walking from Mexico to Canada. So he takes this journey, and what's important to note here is that due to the eunuch's condition, and the laws in Deuteronomy regarding his mutilation, he would not have been allowed into the temple in Jerusalem. So he's taken a 5-month journey to Jerusalem where he's not able to step foot into that temple. On his way home from this, he's sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, "Go to that chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. It was typical to read out loud back then to help with memory. So this eunuch is reading this passage, and he's trying to know it. "Do you understand what you're reading?" Philip asked. "How can I," he said, "unless someone explains it to me?" So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. This is the passage of scripture the eunuch was reading. It comes from Isaiah 53. It's there if you want to check it out. "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "Who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What can prevent me from being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about, preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea. This is the word of the Lord. What a remarkable story, right? We've got 2 men who meet on the side of a desert road. One shares Christ with the other. One gets baptized on the side of a desert road. And then the other is beamed back up into the sky to go spread the gospel elsewhere. We could leave it at that and we could be amazed. But I don't want us to miss out on some of the radical things happening in this story. See, this is the story of a powerful connection between 2 very different people. The eunuch, sexually different, from Ethiopia, culturally different, who is an important official, that's a major difference in status here, connects with a wandering Jewish disciple of Jesus named Philip, and as a result comes to a profound understanding of who Christ is. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to check in and ask you, through whose eyes are you seeing this story? I'll be honest with you, it's easy for me to assume the role of Philip. Okay, he's a young, clean-cut guy, maybe recently graduated from USC or UCLA, and he's just out in the world trying to share his faith with others. For the purposes of today's story, I want to encourage us to step into the role of the eunuch, to look through the eunuch's eyes, though it might be different from yours or mine. Let's look at the story through his eyes, because it's the eunuch here who models a behavior of a pursuit of true connection. And there are two major elements to how he does that we'll talk about. He does this through proximity and through vulnerability. We'll look at the proximity he models for us first. In verse 31, we see that the eunuch extends an invitation to Philip. He invites him to come up into his chariot. Why do you think he does this? Imagine you're driving down the road and you don't know your way, your phone's dead, you don't have directions, and someone's walking along the sidewalk, looks very different from you, but they're willing to help you out. So you slow your car down, and you don't just roll your window down, even though they're ready to engage with you in that way. No, you open your door and you tell them, "Come in my car. Come sit next to me." And now you're sitting in a confined space with a complete stranger. It's kind of a funny move. It makes me feel uncomfortable. I have a pretty strong sense of a personal bubble, so maybe that's why. But why do you think the eunuch does this? Well, what he's doing there through that invitation is he's eliminating one last barrier between him and Philip. See, there's already so much that should keep these two separated from each other, that should cause distance between these two. Yet we're crossing all those boundaries. We're getting proximate. I'm going to tell you a story about a man I knew named Alex. We go way back. We met years ago when I was in prison. You might not have seen that coming. I took a class in college called Education Behind Bars, where we studied the opportunities available to people who are incarcerated right alongside them. Now, at that time, I was a young female college student from an area similar to Newport Beach. I didn't know anybody who had gone to prison. To me, prison was a far-off corner of society, a community of people with whom I assumed I absolutely could not relate to. But I worked with these people on a project. I found myself in this class going once a week to sit next to them, to study with them, to work together. And I worked especially with this man named Alex, and in that opportunity I had to work alongside him, I heard about what landed him in prison. And I heard about this rare opportunity he had to take a class, a college-level course in prison. That was not something that was available in California. I went to school in Washington at the time. And I heard about the power this education had for him. Because when he was growing up, nobody in his neighborhood ever promoted education. And now, through this opportunity, he was discovering more about himself. He was discovering a potential that he had. He was discovering that he was more than what his neighborhood had ever told him he could be. That he was more than what had landed him in prison. And he was eager now to gain more knowledge, to gain more skills, so that he could come out a contributing member of society. So he could come out and support his family. And so he was behind bars studying law, dreaming up legislation that would give people like him more of these opportunities. Sitting next to this tatted up convict, I quickly realized that he knew way more about the power of education than I did as a young college student. That he knew way more about the local politics and the power of one person's voice than I ever did. I learned a great deal from these men, but the most significant lesson that I learned was that I could learn from them. From these people with whom I would have had no natural contact, and with whom contact was initially uncomfortable and a little bit frightening, even though I was in a high-security facility, probably one of the safest places in the world for me to be. That fear was there. Because there's something strange about how differences provoke fear in us. So we build all these barriers to protect ourselves from people who are different from us. But it was in getting proximate, in sharing a desk with an inmate, that I realized these people had a lot to teach me. There's a man named Bryan Stevenson. You may have heard of him. He's a lawyer. He wrote a book turned into a movie called Just Mercy that talks about his career, which he devoted to death row inmates. Because for every 9 people executed on death row, 1 is exonerated, found to have been innocent that whole time. So he works to provide these people a fair trial before their execution. And Bryan Stevenson doesn't have a family, doesn't have a wife, doesn't have kids. He spent most of the days of his career sitting next to these death row inmates, talking with them, hearing from them, sharing stories with them. And he writes and speaks often now on this concept of proximity. And he says this, he says that proximity is a pathway. That if you are willing to get closer to people who are suffering, you will find the power to change the world. What the eunuch does in this moment is he invites Philip to get closer. He invites Philip to get proximate to him. And he'll discover that a deeper connection exists on the other side of that barrier. But it's not just the physical barrier that he removes. No, it's not enough to just sit next to someone to share a space with them, right? Have you ever sat close to someone and felt totally disconnected from them? The eunuch here does another remarkable thing. He exposes his vulnerability, and he takes away an emotional barrier at the same time. Let's go back to the scripture. The first thing the eunuch says to Philip is, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" I want you to remember, though different from Philip, this eunuch is a powerful official. He has significant status over Philip. But in this moment, he takes a step down and he says, "I don't know, and I need help knowing." The ability to say, "I don't know," is a powerful gift. And that's only something I've come to realize recently. See, I was that kid in high school, really all of school, who never participated. I didn't raise my hand, I didn't contribute to class discussions, and never spoke up because I was terrified that people would discover my ignorance, that I might ask a dumb question, that I might have misinterpreted the poem we were discussing. So I never spoke up, because where I grew up, we so valued intellectual ability that at a young age, I learned to never expose any weakness in this area. So I would either be 100% certain of what I had to say or completely silent. There was no room for external processing, for letting people into my unformed thoughts. To say "I don't know" out loud would have been terrifying and vulnerable. Well, it got to a point where my senior year, my end of my high school career, a teacher emailed the entire class, and he called me out for this. He said in this email, a public email, he said, "Dana, if you don't start speaking up in class, I'm going to have to kick you out of this course." Isn't that harsh? So I tried to get the courage to start speaking up more. And I found at the end of my senior year a kid named Jason, who was another fairly quiet student, came up to me and he said, "Dana, you have such great things to say. I wish you had spoken up more. I wish I had heard more of them this year." And then he shared with me that how through seeing me speak up after having been silent all year, it was giving him the courage to speak up more as well. See, what I hadn't realized was that by trying so hard to cover up my ignorance, this perceived weakness that I thought I had, I was walling off my ability to learn, my ability to connect, to be known by my classmates. And I'll tell you, I was so focused on myself, on protecting myself, I never really heard what they had to say either. In the book of Genesis, you may have heard this story. God creates Adam and Eve, and they spend time together in the Garden of Eden, walking around, being together. And then there's a moment when everything changes. Adam and Eve eat the apple. And what's the indication that everything has changed? They've started to sew clothes for themselves. And God notices that they're wearing clothes now, and what's his response to them? He says, "Who told you you were naked?" Now, I used to hear this, read this, and picture angry God in my mind. He knew they'd done something wrong. He's wagging his finger, and he says, "Who told you you are naked?" But what if God was just heartbroken there in front of his children who had been convinced of a lie, asking them, "Who told you you were naked?" That walking completely exposed and vulnerable to each other and to me was a bad thing. Who told you you had to hide yourself, to cover yourself up? What an illustration this is of the fear we have of exposing ourselves to each other. So we spend our resources trying to cover ourselves up. Who told you you were naked? What a question for Newport Beach. I spent a lot of conversations with our associates, with these people who had moved here from across the country, talking about how they had never really thought twice about the clothes they wore until they moved here. They're here for a leadership institute, and they're thinking about the clothes that they're wearing. And I wanted to ask them, who told you you were naked? That you needed the right clothes, that you needed the right house, a nice car, a successful career where you work long hours, a cool Instagram. Who told you you were naked? How do these things help us to connect with each other? Or are they just metaphorical clothing, hiding us from each other, hiding us from God? It's easy to think that vulnerability, that sharing who we are in our unformed thoughts, in our feelings, in our weaknesses, it's easy to think that it's dangerous or that it puts us at risk, that it's something to be afraid of. So we go success forward, certainty forward. In covering up these weaknesses, we not only hide that, but we hide our ability to connect as well. We have this eunuch here who's got all the money and power, but he spends no time trying to build up his image in front of Philip. He doesn't say, well, here's what I do know. I know this and this and this, and I just have this one little question. No, he starts with his weakness. He says, I don't know. I need help knowing. When the eunuch invited Philip into his chariot, he invited him into his ignorance. He invited him into his weakness, to how little he knew. And it's because of his willingness to expose that he moves forward into profound understanding. The passage the eunuch was reading from Isaiah 53, It's often called the suffering servant. We'll take a look back at it. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. This is talking about Christ. When Philip goes to explain Christ to this eunuch, he doesn't say, disregard this stuff. He was resurrected. Let's focus on that. We don't need to worry about all that. No, it says Philip starts with this passage. He starts with Christ's humility, with Christ's wounds. He starts with weakness, and it's this that unites these two men. And the result of that connection is that this eunuch goes away dancing, rejoicing, not even aware that his conversation partner has disappeared into thin air, because he's so connected into the heart of God at that moment. The passage right before this one in Acts chapter 8 tells the story of a man named Simon who saw all that the disciples were doing, these miraculous acts of God, and he says, I want in. And so he offers them money in hopes of gaining this ability. Now, the authors of these books took great care to write these stories and place them in specific order. So we have this glaring contrast from one story of a man who tries to purchase the gospel to another story of a man who has plenty of means but knows that it won't be his power, it won't be his privilege that will get him to the gospel, but it will be his humility. When we are willing, when we have the courage to move closer to people, to get proximate and cross those boundaries that separate us, to get vulnerable and share more of who we are, to start with our weaknesses, we will know Christ more as a result of that. I don't know what that looks like in your life. It might not mean you go to prison, but maybe you spend time in a community of people who look different from you. Maybe you start conversations with people you love saying, I'm sorry. Maybe you step out of your comfort zone in relationships in some way. I don't know what that looks for you. But what I do know is that what the eunuch models here in his courage is exactly what God modeled to us in the incarnation. When he got proximate to us in all of our scary differences in the form of a naked human baby who grew up in what's now modern-day Palestine to be humiliated and killed on a cross. That's not the end of the story, but it's a significant part of that. Because that is true love, that God would identify with us in our weakness and show us what's on the other side of it. If we could only have the courage to trust that it's love waiting on the other side as we choose to break down these boundaries, we might just find ourselves dancing away, rejoicing, just like the eunuch. Would you bow your heads and pray with me?